Time to elevate. You're running on empty with Matt and Tony.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Running on Empty. I'm Matt.
And I'm Tony.
And we're running on empty. And Tony, I don't know how you do it, man. You always get these amazing interviews lined up. So why don't you, let's just jump in today. And who do we have?
Yeah, Matt. And, I'm sure you would agree with me that there's never been a time in our country where we needed rigorous investigative journalism as much as we need right now.
Right now.
And yet, establishment newspapers and television have been cutting back on reporters for decades now. And we have in Wisconsin, fortunately, a major exception to that rule, and it's the Wisconsin Examiner, wisconsinexaminer.com. And we have with us today one of their great journalists, Erik Gunn. Erik, thank you for being here today. And let me tell our listeners a little bit about Erik. Erik Gunn reports and writes on work and the economy, along with related subjects for the Wisconsin Examiner. He spent 24 years as a freelance writer for Milwaukee Magazine, for the Isthmus, for the Progressive, and other publications, winning awards for investigative reporting, feature writing, beat coverage, business writing, and commentary. He's an East Coast native and previously covered labor for the Milwaukee Journal after reporting for newspapers in upstate New York and Northern Illinois. He's a graduate of Beloit College in Wisconsin and also the world-famous Columbia School of Journalism. Erik, thanks for being here. And let's start off by asking you, what do you see as the role of an online news source like the Wisconsin Examiner that you work for?
Well, I think the Wisconsin Examiner is, and its parent organization, States Newsroom, have a real distinctive niche that they've been creating for themselves, that we've been creating for ourselves, I should say. States Newsroom was conceived to put state news bureaus in state government news bureaus in place in as many states as they could. And Wisconsin was about number 16, I think, of theirs. And then they've since grown further. The thinking behind that was that state government was an area that was getting some of the shortest shrift in local coverage around the country as newspapers were cutting back.
Right.
And that there needed to be a new venues for that. The other part of our model is that our material is shared with other publications that want to use it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a model similar to what ProPublica does, and some other some other organizations that are in this sort of nonprofit news space. We are a nonprofit, and we don't do advertising. We don't have paywalls.
Right.
I think we are there to try to fill in gaps that are missing. We also have, I think, a certain orientation that says what is fundamentally important to the public, to the voters, to the people,
mm-hmm.
As opposed to a lot of political coverage that is more about the horse race, is more about who's in, who's out, who's on top, who's not, that kind of thing. We really try to go at it from a more of a ground's eye,
mm-hmm.
ground level view. And there's clearly stuff that we're covering that hasn't been covered elsewhere. And there are other things that, are covered elsewhere, but I think we still bring a different kind of coverage to it.
Right.
And I'm especially focusing on the voices that may get shut out of some of those conversations.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a bit. Let me ask you a question. You spent quite a few years writing for print newspapers. How does writing the Wisconsin Examiner, which, by the way, people can go to at wisconsinexaminer.com and can actually sign up to receive a daily newsletter. how, and Wisconsin Examiner is strictly online, correct? There's no print product?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay, so how does writing for a strictly online publication, how is that different from when you wrote for print newspapers?
Well, probably in some respects, the biggest difference is that there isn't, a rolled up thing that lands on my porch in the morning or a magazine that lands in my mailbox once a month, and that I can then open up and see my name in print on a piece of paper. I probably still, I'm an old guy now, and I probably still come to this as, in some ways, the way I always did. With, in terms of the style of writing and the approach, I tend to still think much more in terms of the print thing. Although I'm learning a few things. So I think that's the big difference for me. Really is one certainly big difference here is we don't have strict length limits that are governed by what your advertising sales were that day in your print product, right? But there is, I think, less of a difference, or there's such a variety of online publications, as you of course know, but I don't think there's as much of a difference in the sense of what we do in terms of the output that's significant because it's online.
Yeah.
I guess just the other thing is it allows us to get stuff up faster.
Exactly. You talked about the Examiner filling a niche, covering state government in a very mindful and thorough way. Erik, what in your judgment have been the consequences of the establishment press not covering state capitals? I mean, do you think that democracy has suffered as a result of the major media pulling out of things like covering state capitals?
I think that there's certainly a terrible lack of information that gets to the general public, and when it is reported, it often ends up being again more framed in ways that don't particularly relate to how people live their lives.
Right.
I'll be honest, I think that Wisconsin is not the worst example of that. We have very uneven, in some ways, very mixed coverage in this state. But, there certainly is a larger presence in our state capital among press than in some state capitals around the country.
Mm-hmm.
But I still think that there's also this tendency that's become, I think, starker in recent years to frame a lot of the things that are going on in terms of strategy rather than in terms of paying attention to what helps and what hinders democracy.
Exactly. So why is that? Do you think that do the journalists figure that gets more clicks or gets more attention if they cover it as a horse race or cover it as a conflict?
I think that covering it that way is in some sense easier. Yeah. Because you don't have to be perceived as taking sides. Although ironically enough, even covering it that way still gets perceived as taking sides depending on who's reading the story. So it's not like it really actually helps if that's the objective. Whether that should be the objective is, of course, another question.
Exactly. Well, one thing I said in the intro is that you've spent a lot of time over the years writing about work and the economy, and I'm really intrigued by some of your recent stories. For example, can you tell us about what's going on in Janesville with the employer? You wrote about this recently. The employer Huff Corps, which I guess has been employing people, building things like room dividers for many, many years in the Janesville area, blue collar area. And I guess they were taken over by a private equity firm. And that's had pretty devastating consequences for Janesville. Can you tell us what's gone on there?
Well, basically, the new owners, going back a few years now, but the owners this summer announced that they would be essentially closing manufacturing in Janesville and setting up manufacturing in Mexico. And so you've had, more than 100 people put in, decades of work there who have been put out on the street. At least there are, federal programs that are helping them get into retraining, but it's still quite devastating to see, if you've been counting on a particular job and it's not anything, we're not talking about a technological change here, we're just, or something, it's not like automation replacing people, which, is its own issue, but it's just simply a decision to chase after cheaper wages.
Exactly.
And a belief that perhaps anybody can be trained to do those jobs. It will be interesting to see over time how that actually turns out.
Yeah, we're going to put a link to that story on our YouTube site. It's I think, a great example of your writing style. I mean, you spoke to quite a few of the workers impacted by this, didn't you?
Yeah, it was Senator Baldwin came in to because she's been raising issues, and I've seen other kinds of sessions that she's held with groups of people to really focus on this private equity issue and the lack of responsibility for and connections with local communities.
Right.
So she came in and had a conversation with a bunch of folks, and I had my own conversations with them in the time after that, and just the variety of different people's stories and so on was quite compelling to me.
I've noticed that Democratic Party interests are now running ads where they're essentially blaming Ron Johnson for what happened at Huff Corps, claiming that he voted for legislation that made it easier to take jobs to other countries. Are you aware of that?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen their campaigns on that and so on. I'm not particularly surprised,
right?
Just from a purely political standpoint, it seems like a fairly low-hanging fruit for
exactly
for that.
Well, it does bother me that again, not to keep dumping on the establishment media, but they will spend weeks and weeks and weeks on things like critical race theory in the schools. Meanwhile, something like this, where we've got employers that have been stable in a major city for decades. If it was not for the Wisconsin Examiner, I would not know much about this story, right? So, I mean, you talk about the niche you guys are filling. I just wish that other sources around the state would pick up on this, because these are real issues for working people around Wisconsin. Another one of your recent stories that I'm really intrigued by is the movement to unionize at Collectivo, the coffee shop, right? Which likes to present itself as this kind of like hipster, kind of like progressive, cutting edge kind of coffee, right? But Collectivo's ownership is very resistant to the union drive. Is that right?
That's correct. They even went so far as to hire an out from Oklahoma that specializes in conducting campaigns to keep unions out. That honestly, there's still some lingering litigation at the NLRB about that's still I've been following to see when that gets resolved. And because after the election, the employer has the opportunity to file objections that then get heard in a hearing of their own. So it's kind of interesting because this is something that I am interested in developing more reporting on. The idea of progressive corporate cultures sometimes, more often, surprisingly often, stops at the issue of unionization.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to mention like an even more unusual story is there's a restaurant in Milwaukee that went out and said to MASH, the Milwaukee Area Service and Hospitality Workers, which is affiliated with SEIU, we would like you to organize our people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I did a story about that a couple months ago.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a real rarity in that
Yeah.
in that kind of thing. But
you've been following the union movement in this country for quite a few decades. And as you know, we've got a lot of worker activism going on right now, correct? I mean,
yeah,
there's not like literal strikes. I mean, in the formal sense, right? But it seems like people are striking in many different ways.
Well, and there are little
yeah, like John Deere,
strikes.
right?
I mean, you got John Deere, you've got the cookie company there. But of course, they don't have the particular. I mean, there's a John Deere lawnmower plant but they're not in that whole contract. So there has been this wave of actual strikes going on. We just don't happen to have them in Wisconsin by the circumstances of geography, I think, and maybe there's some deeper things that are could be explored about that. But
do you see the union movement though being able to make gains over the next few years?
I think they are already starting to do so, and I also think that there remain tremendous institutional, structural blockages, if you will, that is going to make that more difficult. But I also have to say, and this kind of goes back to your earlier point, that in addition to the actual, sort of traditional strikes that are going on, you've got what one union leader said to me, he's really had kind of an unofficial strike, and that's what this so-called labor shortage that people have been complaining about in the latter days of the pandemic is as much about as anything. That people are saying, I'm fed up, I'm not going to take it anymore. Yeah. Maybe there are different ways to make my living, and just giving it up,
Yeah, well, a lot of people, they were in, especially the service industry. My daughter was in the service industry, and she's moved on into something that pays a whole lot better. She's got benefits with it. She's not getting minimum wage plus tips, things like that. I think it's time for, maybe an article about it, the conversation royally changing, because the employees are now holding the cards, and employers that were, paying, what is it, $2-3 an hour plus possible tips, were getting away with this. And we had a big case here in Colorado, because if that does not add up to minimum wage, which is now, I think it's 10.32 or 11.32 an hour. If what you're making with tips does not meet that, the employer has to go up to do that. So again, I just think that the employers are like, well, we don't have enough workers. Well, why? Let's ask this question. Let's change. Let's point it out and have them be like, oh, well, we didn't see it that way. Well, of course you didn't. But anyway,
when Wisconsin's Republican majority in the legislature was trying to push for the state to end early the supplemental unemployment benefits, they kept they and the business, the big business lobbies kept blaming those for the trouble people have had hiring.
Right.
I was always highly skeptical of that. I mean, there've been actually, a series of, and I, kind of reported on all this through the line. There've been a series of studies that actually, use good old fashioned, macroeconomics to see what was going on, and said, there is no evidence. There is no evidence that the supplemental pay was making a difference. In fact, there are some studies that actually seem to point to that where there was supplemental unemployment pay was continuing, more people were actually going back to work because they felt that they could manage better, with that gave them some extra help to go out and find the right job for them, and instead of not.
Absolutely. Erik, let's move to the topic of voting rights while we have you here. Back in June, you and your colleague Melanie Conklin wrote what I thought was really an outstanding piece called "The Broad Battle Against Limiting Voting Rights." And in that piece, you talk about some of the Republican legislature's attempts to limit voting rights. And it turns out, and again, I would have never known this were it not for your story, there's actually a lot of movement against impacts to limit voting rights in Wisconsin. So can you talk a little bit about what are those efforts to limit the voting rights and what kind of coalition is out there to resist it?
Sure. And I really do have to give, a lot of the credit for that to my colleague who has been on that story as well. Melanie does a lot of the legislative reporting, and so she picked on that. But there were a group of bills in that story. A lot of them focused on the access to the ballot in places like nursing homes or people who are confined at home and that sort of thing. And kind of the bills would have made that whole effort to enable those folks to vote much more restrictive. And this really galvanized a lot of pushback by people representing and who themselves were members of the community with disabilities. That there was also, I think, there have been people that have been actually organizing around this issue for a very, very long time. And I'm thinking of the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, Common Cause, and they were able to, bring some I think, analysis of why this is important to the subject. But again, galvanizing those folks. And then you saw other groups, piling on in a sense, and joining this effort. You had progressive faith groups. Honestly, the way I even had a part in that story is kind of, my big areas are, workplace and the economy. And I've also, and I really need to update that bio, do health policy stuff. And of course, COVID, intersected those. But kind of my third kind of mini beat is the intersection of progressive faith groups with political activism.
Wow.
And I resist calling that really the religious left, because that's a handy shorthand, but it's really, there's many things wrong with the book. I don't know if you've read a book by Jack Jenkins that came out a year ago on the role that progressive faith groups have been in advancing some things. For a fascinating book, American Prophets, it's called. Anyway, so they had one of these coalitions, faith coalitions, had organized basically a news conference to draw attention to these these voting suppression bills, and mobilize opposition within their larger constituencies about that. And that's kind of how I ended up even having a piece of that story. I think the heavy lifting on it.
Well, again, this is why, for me, the Wisconsin Examiner is so valuable, because when you're looking at mainstream media nationally and in our state, religious activism is always framed on the right. They're perceived as being in the anti-abortion movement. They're against critical race theory. They don't like masking. They might be anti-vaccination. Meanwhile, there are an incredible amount of people acting in what you're calling the progressive left way, which has a long tradition in this country, going back. I mean, we could go back to Martin Luther King Jr., who I would call, part of the progressive faith left or whatnot. And again, our modern media, the mainstream, seems to act as if that doesn't even exist anymore.
It has gotten, I think, so much less coverage and attention than, you don't see very much. Every once in a while, you see a story about the Poor People's Campaign and
Right.
Reverend Barber, but they've been just continuously active for the last several years. It kind of started in a sense that some of this subbeat when I was freelancing and doing stuff with the Progressive magazine. So I did a couple of stories there that revolve around these kinds of issues. So I've kept my hand in there, although that is not, my primary focus.
Right.
But
on the voting rights, it looks like the Republicans in Madison are kind of like doubling down now on the efforts to limit voting rights. I mean, now it's kind of like expanded into. Didn't they recently file a sheriff? Was it in Racine?
The Racine County Sheriff
filed felony charges against the state elections board.
You're right. It purported to find that there was, understand policies that the entire elections board had agreed to in open sessions back in the early stages of the pandemic in 2020 about what to do to ensure that people who are in nursing homes could actually still exercise their franchise when outsiders were not being allowed to come into nursing homes to avoid, worsening, outbreak conditions and so on.
It just seems like such a blatantly partisan type of attack. I think that Megan Wolf, she's the chair of the Wisconsin Elections Commission.
She's the executive director. I think she has been just like the archetype of the nonpartisan, mindful, conscientious public official. And yet listening to some of these characters, you would think that she's out there violating laws. I just find it appalling. And again, I hate to keep dumping on mainstream media, but I would love to see Wisconsin Examiner style of rigorous reporting on these kinds of issues. And it's just not out there. Mm-hmm. I got to give a shout out to my colleague, Henry Redmond, who joined us about 9 months after we launched and has just done yeoman's work in covering rural Wisconsin as kind of his primary beat, but the elections board is part of what he does. And I think he's really done a great job in reporting honestly about what's going on and not getting, I think part of our brief is not to sort of fall into the false equivalency kind of traps and the he said, she said, and it's, who can make up their mind and so on.
Right. Eric, we got a few minutes left and we know you're a big Bruce Springsteen fan and Matt has a question for you about Bruce.
Well, Bruce has been getting a lot of heat lately. What do you feel about that? I would still love to see him in concert, whatever. And
what kind of heat has it been getting?
His show. I think he's got a show in New York right now, and people are like blasting him because he's like demanding that in order to see his show, you got to be vaccinated.
Oh,
so I'd still
good for him,
right?
This isn't Springsteen. My son took me for the third time back in September to a Dead and Company concert.
Oh,
we all had to show our vaccine. We all had to show our vaccine cards.
Wow.
Before we could get in. I have no grief with. I have no problem with vaccine mandates for entertainment and places where you're going to be packing lots of people together. And I'm actually pretty glad that he's doing that. I hadn't actually heard about the backlash to it, but maybe
is there a Springsteen song that you think is especially appropriate to the times right now?
Oh man, God.
Youngstown, the one he did in the 90s.
Youngstown is a great one. Death to My Hometown.
Oh yeah.
Deeply Angry.
Yeah.
Song. I mean, that whole, that whole album of 2012 is just, I think, a real, in some ways, a kind of a turning point album for him among many that he's had over the years. Right?
Well, you remember the Nebraska album from the 80s,
God,
right?
Yes,
the acoustic one. I mean, I feel like that one could come out today.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Right. And it's just amazing. And we saw the Democrats lose the governor's race in Virginia, and it seems like the Democrats now have like a working class problem. And I think people like Springsteen, I wish they would listen more to a popular artist like that, right? I mean, he's always had this connection to the working class people.
Well, and often the issue there is as much around race as anything.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah, very much so.
With regards to Virginia, I know the Republican won the governorship there, but I don't hear anybody talking about how this election was rigged or fake or, why is that not happening right now? I mean, the Democrats should be upset, right? At least to respond exactly in kind, like the Republicans would have if the Democrat would have won. Oh, it was fixed, it was rigged, election fraud, but whatever.
Yeah, I don't think Terry McAuliffe has come out yet and said that this was rigged.
No. So we'll see what happens. But
Erik, thank you so much for being here. We hope you can come back again, and we're going to link some of your articles on our YouTube site. And I actively encourage people to go to wisconsinexaminer.com, and I get the daily newsletter online every day, and it really keeps me aware of some of the real vital issues going on in the state of Wisconsin. So thank you for that, Erik, and we hope you can come back again at some point soon.
Well, happy to, and I certainly would heartily recommend that several of my colleagues would be great interviews for you too.
Wonderful.
Wow, cool. Thank you.
All right. Thanks much.
All right. Thanks so much. Wow, Tony, I got to tell you, after pretty much all these interviews here, I still feel like we have the teacher-student role here because I'm learning so much on these interviews, man. This is fantastic.
Well, I've been following Erik Gunn's writing for a long time, and he's he just has the kind of style of reporting that is just so informative, and he puts the human face on everything.
Yeah.
I'm going to put some links of his articles on our YouTube site. And we talked about the Huffcore story, the corporation in Janesville. And what's so impressive about that is that he actually went and spoke to the workers and got some real testimony from them. And he really does that in all of his stories. And so it's very informative. I would encourage everyone to go to wisconsinexaminer.com. You can sign up for a free daily newsletter, which I find to be really valuable. Helps keep me informed about what's going on in my state.
Yeah, well, if you really care about Wisconsin, this is the publication because you're going to see stuff there that you don't see anywhere else. I mean, not to really knock the other. I mean, they have a job to do too, but I think the Examiner just does it way better than all the rest of them do.
Yeah, we're going to have to find the Colorado equivalent, and I'm sure there is a Colorado equivalent.
Well, we have
somewhere.
a couple of them out here, so looking forward to doing that.
Yeah, so let's get the Colorado, because my guess is, Matt, and you've been living out there for a while now. Wisconsin and Colorado have similar issues.
Oh yeah,
right. Absolutely. I mean, you guys have obviously been a lot more progressive on things like cannabis legalization. But you've got some really zany, crazy politicians out there, just as we do here.
Oh, yeah. And they show up in our county every now and then, and that's when we take a vacation. Wow. So we definitely have a lot to talk about. maybe that's just one of the shows that we do in the future. We just have it. Here's all the things about Colorado and Wisconsin that are similar.
Yeah.
And here's the things where we're way off, but like things that Wisconsin's doing that Colorado could do and vice versa. So good idea.
Well, I mean, both of the states were always perceived to be two of the most progressive
yeah,
in the country. I think that Colorado has mostly managed to keep that reputation.
Mhm.
Wisconsin, unfortunately, has lost it very much over the last 20 years, but there's still struggles to get it back. And again, that's what I love about Erik's writing, is he keeps me informed of some of the street level struggles that are going on
yeah,
to maintain some of Wisconsin's historic progress for average, everyday working people. So
yeah. Well, like that voting rights. I mean, you read that article, people go, "Oh my gosh, I didn't know there was that much going on."
right.
You know, so kudos to that.
Yeah. And so if the legislature is going to take away voting rights, they're not going to do it without a fight. And
right.
it's really inspiring to see that.
Mhm.
It turns out, you watch the mainstream media, you think that it's only Stacey Abrams in Georgia,
right.
who is a voting. I mean, nothing against Stacey Abrams. I think she's fantastic.
She's amazing.
But there are Stacey Abrams in every community.
Yeah.
And we just don't hear about them. The
No.
Wisconsin Examiner goes out and tries to find those people and talk to them. So
Yep.
anyway, Matt, thanks again for doing this. And as always, I hope that our listeners stay elevated.
Stay elevated, everybody. We'll see you next time.
You're running on empty with Matt and Tony.